Good evening. This is Assemblywoman Cottie, Petrie-Norris. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's town hall. Tonight's topic is the California economy. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic is an unprecedented crisis, and it has presented an absolutely unprecedented financial challenge for our state, for our country, and for the entire world. Tonight, we'll be answering your questions about the fiscal outlook for California, the challenges that are confronting the state right now, the work that we are doing to get the economy back on track, and the path to recovery. I am thrilled to be joined by two very special guests this evening. We are joined tonight by State Controller Betty Yee and the legislative analyst for the California Legislature, Gabriel Petek. Thank you both so much for being here and for answering our viewers' questions tonight. So before we get started, let's start with introductions. Controller Yee, thank you so much for being here. Sure. Introduce yourself to the folks at home.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm Betty Yee. I'm the State Controller of California, and in that capacity, I serve as the Chief Fiscal Officer for the state of California. And my job is really to have oversight responsibilities of the state's finances. And, I would just say in opening this up in terms of a perspective about our finances and the economy right now, I'm just very grateful for the work that the prior administration and to this current administration, the legislature has done to prepare for this time. We actually met this pandemic with fairly strong fiscal footing, historic levels of reserves, with much of our debt paid down. And so, from that perspective, I would say that we actually probably fared better than many other jurisdictions that for whom this probably came as much more of a shock. So I know we're going to go into more details later, but certainly that work and discipline, and Assemblywoman, you've been a part of that, was very helpful in terms of how we started to meet this crisis.
Absolutely. And Gabe Petek, thank you so much for being here. Can you introduce yourself to our folks watching at home?
Yes, my name is Gabe Petek. I'm the state's legislative analyst. I was appointed to the position last year in January of 2019. And our office, just because not everybody is as familiar with it, is the legislature's fiscal and policy advisor. You could think of it sort of as the legislature's version of the Department of Finance, which the governor has. So we try to provide fiscal and policy analysis on a nonpartisan basis to the legislature. And a bit of interesting trivia would be that we were the first office like this created in the nation, and now all 50 states have an office that provides that kind of fiscal advice to their legislatures. And our office was actually the model that they used when they developed the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO. So. But I think a lot of what I would say would echo what Controller Yee said about the budget situation. Clearly, we've gone into a recession. It's been made official now. And the only question is how long it will last or how deep it will be. And about that, we have a lot of uncertainty. And, it's creating a significant budget challenge. But as the controller said, we go into it on pretty strong fiscal footing, so that's a key advantage this time around as compared to the last time in the 2009 timeframe.
So before we jump into questions around the financial outlook and dig into some more of those specifics, I think it might be just useful to remind folks at home of what the process is for the state for establishing our budget. So California is I think people know, we're not just the largest economy in this country. We are the 5th largest economy in the world. So Mr. Petek, can you just walk everybody through kind of the process for establishing the state's budget?
Well, yeah, every year there's a process. It begins with actually, our office would put out a fiscal outlook for the legislature, usually in November, and that's sort of looking at the baseline existing budget and what would the cost be to maintain the current level of services to the citizens, And we provide in that outlook our estimates of what the revenues would be over the coming budget year. And then we also look out 3 years in advance also. But then really the big thing that happens in January is the governor presents his budget proposal in January. And once the governor presents the budget proposal, the legislature and we go through and unpack it and try to analyze it. And it addresses funding for our schools, for our various social services, for our correctional system. Anything really that the state does is funded out of our budget. Then the process goes on like that, and until May, the governor revises the budget proposal based on updated economic and revenue numbers. And we kind of go through the process again. And then by June 15th, the legislature has a constitutional obligation to pass a budget. And then we wait for the governor to sign it before the start of the fiscal year on July 1st. So that's kind of I think a high level of the process. I don't know if there'd be anything you'd add.
And then Controller Yee, so is there anything you would add? And then also, if you could just kind of walk through the role that your office plays in order to ensure that that we're responsibly managing our taxpayer dollars and ensuring that they are being spent efficiently and effectively.
Absolutely. No. And Gabe gave a great oversight. What I would add is that this year is quite different because the governor's revision to the budget, we delayed our income tax filing and payment deadline into mid-July, like many other states did, to be in conformity with the federal extension. And so there really wasn't that usual revenue update in the May revision. However, I will say that with respect to the work that we continue to do, it's to just continue to monitor the state's cash position to be sure that we have enough resources to pay all of our obligations, and then the decisions that are going to be made and negotiated between the legislature and the governor, and the final enactment of the budget will essentially then have my team get into gear about what the cash flow will look like for the fiscal year to come, and whether we have enough resources through internal borrowing or whether we'll need to resort to external borrowing as well. But that is the work that we do year round. We have obviously peaks during the year when we have our revenues coming in, where we are a little bit more flush with cash than not, and then other times of the year when we're not. And then I will also say, with respect to this process, I think there is, just in particular because we are under an emergency declaration, the need for just more oversight. And I think this has really been a topic that the legislature has focused on since returning from being off the weeks during the early period of this pandemic. And that is more scrutiny now, more so because the emergency declaration actually gives the executive branch authority to spend any funds that are already appropriated. And so to reconcile all of that, where that money is coming from, for what purpose, I think that's really the heightened scrutiny that all of us should be giving with respect to our oversight responsibility.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I chair the Assembly's Accountability and Administrative Review Committee, and I know I've been fortunate enough to work with you and your team on a couple of projects and initiatives there. And I think that level of scrutiny and oversight is always important. Every dollar is always important, but particularly in a moment like this where we are confronting a historic budget deficit, it's all the more critical and all the more urgent. And we certainly owe that to California's taxpayers. So as Mr. Petek, as you said, we are in the midst right now of finalizing the budget. The legislature will vote on that. We're constitutionally obligated to do so by June 15th, and then that will be enacted by July 1st. When we rewind just 5 months ago, when the governor rolled out his January budget, we had been in a period of basically unprecedented prosperity, right? We had 818 months of growth, record low job numbers, record reserves, record rainy day fund. We are in a really different position right now. We've had 5 million Californians who have filed for unemployment. It's the declaration of the emergency order. As you said, we are officially now in a recession and grappling with a $54 billion budget deficit. So I guess just if you can give us, we'll start, Controller Yee, with you. What's kind of your 30,000 foot view on the economy right now and our fiscal outlook?
It's a great question. And I think Gabe and his team have done really, I think, one of the best perspectives about it. And it really depends on how deep we think, this downturn will be, and how the duration of it, and how sharp the dip will be. My perspective is this. This is a pandemic that, and certainly a crisis that we've not seen. It's so different from what we experienced in 08, 09. It has had impact on both the supply and the demand side. It's a global pandemic. I don't think any sector was spared from having impacts. And so, from that perspective, I would say that it's going to be, a handful of years before we probably are going to see any kind of, positive recovery signs. But all that being said, this is also a time when I think we're talking about not just stabilizing our fiscal and budget situation, but at the same time looking at what we need to do in terms of investing and rebuilding our economy at the same time. So I think that's really going to be the challenging work, certainly of the legislature and the governor together going forward. I think the diversity of our economy has really helped us as well. I mean, I talked about certainly the really favorable budgetary position, the fiscal position we were in at the beginning of this pandemic, but the fact that we aren't seeing, we just put out our cash report for May yesterday, and it actually exceeded the May revision projections. And what that says to me is that there have been impacts. I mean, we know the unemployment claims numbers, but at the same time, when you look at the big three revenue sources, particularly income tax and our sales and use tax, people have had to spend during this pandemic. Those who've been displaced from work tend to be the lower wage service sector workers. And so, what that tells us is that there's a lot of vulnerability in our economy, but at the same time, it still is producing, but really from those who are really among the top income earners.
Right, as you said, the May revenues came in, I think it was like $500 million above forecast. Was that a surprise to you? What do you make of that?
I think it's probably giving us a little bit more of a complexion about the particular impacts it's having on work, different types of work, the sectors that are most heavily affected. And so I think that's just giving us, at least for me, a more granular look at where the impacts are. So on the one hand, surprising. I think I'm going to be looking to July for sure as well. And just beyond that. But I think for this snapshot in time, in some ways not surprising, because when you look at what people have to do when they're sheltering in place, what their needs are, with respect to just trying to live and be sure they have all their needs met during a pandemic. From that perspective, it wasn't surprising.
Interesting. And Mr. Petek, kind of your big picture overview of our outlook and the economy as a whole.
Well, the main thing that we thought about it is that there's just so much uncertainty. This is not a typical recession, if there is such a thing. I mean, this is a recession brought on by this global pandemic. And so there's uncertainty on multiple levels. What is going to be the course of the virus? What will be the policymaker responses in the policymakers in Washington, D.C.? What will be their response? And then, of course, how will the economic actors in our state respond, or even outside of the state? And so with that in mind, what we did was actually develop a fiscal outlook this spring, which is somewhat atypical for us. We normally only do the one outlook in November, but we felt like it would be helpful to the legislature if we could provide an updated outlook or forecast. And in that, we went ahead and developed the outlook under two scenarios. One we called the U-shaped scenario. That's where the economy, comes down and lingers for a little bit, but then starts to experience a more robust recovery in the coming months. The other one we called the L-shaped scenario, so it's somewhat more pessimistic, where the economy went down, but then kind of languished for a bit and had a more protracted recovery. And I have to say, it's been interesting, just even in the past few weeks. I think my own views have shifted a little bit. At first, we kind of thought the L-shaped scenario was probably most likely, but then we had somewhat of a better jobs report last week, and there's some indications that so far anyway, the data points that we're getting are actually a little more like our U-shaped scenario. I do think a very big question will be what happens with Congress, because we have some important federal fiscal supports that will be shutting off essentially in July. And when that happens, there could be some knock-on effects for our economy unless there's some second round that comes through, or I guess it would be third or fourth round. So that's something we're watching closely. But right now, we think that our two broad-based outlook scenarios are actually holding, with a U shape and the L shape, and those translated to budget deficits of somewhere in the range of 18 billion to 31 billion. And so, that's what I know you all have been working on in the legislature.
Right. And we're still planning for actually the governor's scenario, which was even more pessimistic and had and even a bigger deficit. So it's sort of $54 billion if you exclude the stuff that he had rolled into January. It's something like a $48 billion deficit. 38 billion, 48 billion. These are huge numbers when we're talking about needing to make these kinds of cuts in the budget. It's impossible to avoid pain, right? There's no, when we're cutting $50 billion out of the budget, there's no good scenario. I would love to get both of your perspective on just kind of your framework for how do we make these trade-offs? In this kind of a situation, how do we ensure that we're making the right trade-offs about what we're cutting, what we're keeping?
Yeah, this is the challenge, I think, with a crisis like the coronavirus, because we are not only looking at being sure we are at the forefront of protecting health and certainly saving lives, but also looking at the supports necessary to continue to hopefully sustain livelihoods. And because so many aspects of our economy has been affected, it is very tough. I guess what I would say is the shared pain approach that the governor took in his May revision was a very, very tough proposal. I mean, a lot of proposals that are very difficult to swallow, certainly affecting some of our most vulnerable in our communities. But at the same time, we also have a budget that's structured such that, those are, many of those areas are the ones that are discretionary to cut. And so when you have a problem with the magnitude that we're talking about, I don't think it's possible to enact a balanced budget. And by the way, states have to enact balanced budgets. We don't get to get away with just saying it's balanced, but it does have to be balanced, and that's what we operate under. But it is difficult not to have any area spared. And so, and otherwise, I do believe that we're essentially kicking those tough decisions down the road. At some point, those decisions about cutting are going to have to be made. So I think it's that there were some modest revenue increases in the governor's proposal as well, and I think that is certainly a part of how we can fill the gap. But this idea about the reliance on federal funds, I know there's been a lot of robust discussion about that. I would say that our local governments really are devastated. I know our focus is on the state budget, but for so many local governments, we're going to start to see just the devastating impacts that the budget cuts will have on them. I was just reading this morning how, when we talk about the jobs numbers, we don't actually talk about government employment, and yet we've seen just really the magnitude of government employee layoffs that really then speak to what services are going to be diminished, and what's not going to get done that will be serving the public. And so these are painful. And because we're going to be in this situation for a period of years, I do think that what isn't considered now likely will not be left untouched in future years. And so I think the job that the governor has done in pointing that out in his Share the Pain proposal is really giving us the framework about how we have to think about this. And then obviously when the legislature considers this, this is where I think all of you, certainly what you're experiencing in your districts and what you're seeing are going to be the impacts are negotiating, the best outcome with respect to being sure that we can still take care of those who have the least ability to do so for themselves.
And Nat, Mr. Petek, what's your framework? What's your, how do we approach this strategically?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the nature of this recession and the fact that it is predicated on a public health emergency. Mm-hmm. And so, as the controller said, the state does have to enact a balanced budget. But at the same time, the legislature probably wants to be very careful about making reductions to programs that would help us fight against the virus. And so in some ways, it makes the problem even that much harder. And then I think the other thing, though, to keep in mind is that we did come into this on strong fiscal footing. So there's a large reserve in place. The state has significant budget reserves, and it repaid a lot of internal loans and various deferrals and shifts that had been done in the last recession. And while it may not how you'd like to manage the finances in a budget crisis, it can be a tool. And so I think what I'm trying to say is there are some one-time options available to the legislature, and you can, to the extent you want to utilize those, you can phase in at a slower rate the reductions to the budget expenditures that you might otherwise have to make. So to some extent, there's a question of what's the legislature's risk tolerance. If you think the economy will be in a recovery mode by next year, then maybe it makes sense to utilize more of those one-time solutions. But if you're worried that the economy will still be at a low point going on for months and months and still into next year, then you might need to consider making more ongoing adjustments right now, or be prepared to make ongoing adjustments next year when the one-time solutions are used up. And so it's kind of like a savings account in a family. I mean, if you have some kind of economic loss and you don't know what the future holds, you either have to make adjustments or draw down on your savings. And so that's kind of how I think about it. And I think that to a very significant extent, it does kind of depend on what's the overall arching economic outlook and what's the risk tolerance of our policymakers.
Yeah, Assemblywoman, let me just top on to what Gabe just said. So in terms of these one-time options, so what I took office in January 2015, I've not had to do any external borrowing to pay the bills for California. So that's really as a result of the great work of Governor Brown, the legislature, certainly coming into this administration. And so obviously external borrowing we have actually internal borrowable resources have been fairly healthy. And then now and external borrowing we've not had to do, but this might be, the occasion where we want to rely on that. And to Gabe's point, depending on what you believe the outlook will be when the recovery may begin, we can borrow within a fiscal year, we can borrow across fiscal years, but there are options. And so I think those are the conversations that likely will ensue with your leadership and the governor about, just what the collective thought is about the duration of what we're experiencing now.
Right. Well, and I think we're kind of looking at the horizon we're planning for right now is kind of a three-year downturn. And so, we want to make sure that our reserves can stretch over those 3 years. But as you both said, the fact that we were in such a strong fiscal position going into this means that we do have a cushion. We are able to mitigate the pain. And I think that, I feel like there's been a couple of overarching principles that the legislature has had as we've responded to the governor's budget and come up with some alternative proposals. I think one has been first just ensuring that we are, I think, not being kind of penny wise but pound foolish, right? So if you make cuts in 1 year, but then actually in subsequent years that ends up costing you a lot of money, like those don't really make sense. So for example, when we think about cuts to some of our senior services, when we cut some of those senior programs, it actually then ends up having a domino effect that costs us more. So I think that's been one principle, and then the other has just been doing everything that we can to protect core education programs and core healthcare programs. Again, because these are not just kind of line items in a single year, they end up being investments in the future, with benefits in the future. So those have been a couple of our governing principles. As you both know, we're, the budget leadership team from the legislature is in negotiations, right now with the governor's team to come up with a proposal that works. But actually, I want to turn to, and you started to mention, some of the levers we might have for recovery. So want to talk about recovery, and I guess a couple things. So, I guess first question is, from your perspective, where are the places where we get the biggest bang for our buck in terms of investments as we transition from kind of stabilization survival mode to, okay, how do we help the economy recover, and how do we move into economic stimulus? Where are the places where you think we have the highest leverage?
I think if there's anything that has been revealed from this pandemic, it really is, just how shaky, I guess, the foundation of our economy is. When you look at the numbers of unemployment benefit claims and the workers that have been the most heavily affected by the pandemic. I would say that if it's really now recognition that we've had, so many of our workers who are, really lower income earning workers. And so I would hope that as we recover, we think about, livelihoods in a different way, whether these are workers that could actually be in sectors that hopefully can provide a little bit more stability going forward. I think during this pandemic, we've also seen, and some of it's been borne out in the stock market. I mean, if you feel that the market is actually a predictor of the future, I've been actually quite fascinated by the concentration of where the performance has been. A lot of it reflective of the fact that we've been sheltering in place, so all the things that we're really requiring to do that, whether it's the Googles, the Amazons, all of those things that really are helping us as we experience this time. But that market concentration also gives me a lot of worry about how is that going to sustain us over a period of time? And so, obviously, the things that are in demand, the hospitality industry took a huge hit. I think that will be an industry that will look very different when it recovers, and certainly the consumers are wanting a lot more assurance about their own health and safety when they do participate in those sectors after or as they recover. We also have, I think, new industries that are emerging. We are on this virtual meeting platform, and I don't know how many are springing up every day, but I think tech support, tech software, anything tech is going to be just huge going forward as well. With respect to health and safety, cleaning, just, all the things that protect us, personally on that front will do well. So I'm not so sure that I can say that any one sector is going to lead the charge, but I will say that I think technology is going to play a much more important role. And I will just say, even with state government, our experience with telework and what that's going to mean in terms of how we work when we recover also is going to be a question.
I think we might have lost Gabe from bad connection, but maybe he'll come back and join us. And if not, we'll just continue our conversation. But just in a couple of thoughts I have. So I've been engaged. We've got a somewhat informal, but working group with assembly members and state senators. We've got this legislative working group on economic recovery, and I think from my perspective, I think that there are sort of a few areas that I'm very excited about and kind of very, very focused on. So I think that the first is, and I think that are areas where time and again, it has proven to be, sort of a major economic engine and the appropriate thing to invest in. So I think when we think about investments in infrastructure, right. I think that the exciting thing is that, even as we navigate this downturn, as we move through recovery, we can invest in green infrastructure projects, in clean energy projects, in things that continue to move us towards some of our really important policy goals for California. And another big priority for me is education, which I think is also includes and speaks a bit to what you were saying. It's, I think we need to talk more about workforce development and how do we, upskill workers. And I think that was an issue even before the pandemic. We had started to see some slowing in California's job growth. And that wasn't because we didn't have companies hiring, it's because we didn't have a labor pool with the right skills and the right talents to fill those positions. So I think there's a huge opportunity that we really need to seize there as part of a recovery package. And then I think that, the third thing for me is just a real focus on small business. I think small businesses they're the heart and soul of so many of our communities. They're the heart and soul of our economy. They employ 95% of Californians. And so just figuring out, how do we help to stabilize our small businesses so they can survive and be in a position to thrive as we emerge? So those are some of the things that we're working on. And I think that, there's sort of this framework that we're focused on, that people may have heard, the triple bottom line. So it's about profits, people, and planet. And I really do believe that we can structure the investments we make as part of recovery in a way that does deliver on that. So I think that there are some exciting possibilities in the midst of this.
And I think another aspect of that, Assemblywoman, is also just trying to also be mindful of issues of equity. When you look at the impacts of this pandemic and where it has really stricken the hardest, it's been in many of our communities of color, our low-income communities. And when I think about investments, as you're thinking about them going forward, our public health infrastructure and footprint, I think, could probably afford to be hardened a little bit better, and hopefully its footprint spread a little bit more widely to some of those areas of California. And the very same infrastructure that we're using to really combat the coronavirus and public health, if you consider that to be the foundation of all healthcare, is exactly what we're going to need to deal with some of the impacts of the climate crisis going forward as well, whether it's air quality, water supply, chronic health conditions, food security. I mean, those are all the same issues that are touching communities now with respect to this virus.
Mr. Petek, what are your thoughts on recovery? Where should we be focused?
Well, I mean, one thing, as your legislative analyst, I will point out the virtue of doing what we can to protect the solvency of the general fund. I think there's a very significant advantage to maintaining a good fiscal condition, because when you think about a lot of the programs that we pay for out of the general fund, it's going to our teachers, it's going to people that are eligible for safety net programs, and people that are not among us. And so they have what they talk about in economics, that they tend to spend more of the income that they get. And so to the extent that our programs like that are helping people that are fall into economic hardship, maintaining a good, healthy, balanced budget, and ensuring that you have a prudent fiscal plan, which is what you're working on now. But by doing that, you're actually doing a lot, I think, to help the economy and the state go into a recovery.
Right, and you said it's important for us to protect the solvency of the general fund, and part of that is ensuring that we are limiting the amount that we're borrowing. And it can be tempting. You said it's a little bit like managing a household budget. It can be really tempting to go, oh gosh, I can get this low interest credit card and just buy whatever I want. I think it's one thing if you have the low interest credit card and you save it for the genuine emergency, and if your car breaks down, then you use it to buy that. But it's important in the same way that the folks at home shouldn't just get a credit card and go out and buy a new car and a new motorcycle and a new refrigerator and a new sofa all in 1 week. I think we have to have that same discipline as a state. And as Controller, you said that we have not done any external borrowing for since 2015. Do you anticipate that being kind of part of the solution? Because there are times it does make sense to borrow. So that's the the kind of tension here.
Yeah, no, sure. Certainly it's in the arsenal and available. So as I said, we also have right now pretty robust internal borrowable resources as well. So I look at this as kind of a tiered approach, certainly from my team. all the way from how we do internal borrowing, all the way to actually deferring payments, which we hope we never have to do. People are counting on us during these times.
Right, right. So looking back to the Great Recession, what are some lessons that that we need to take away from that downturn and subsequent recovery? Some things that we did well, some things that we want to make sure we don't repeat.
I could start off by offering that part of what you can do is actually what you've already done, which was, build those reserves. And even last year in the budget last year, sometimes I don't think this gets enough coverage or attention, but there was over $9 billion of state resources put toward paying down some of our long-term liabilities on the pension side and repaying some of those internal borrowing mechanisms that the controller spoke of. And so, the good news is you did those things during the good times so that now you're in a stronger position in the tough times. And, so that's really the lesson that comes, forefront in my mind. And it would just be a good thing to remember the next time we're in a recovery. I think some of the other options that we learned a little bit about was the use of furloughing state workers in the last recession, and how it can generate some savings, but at the same time, the cash, kind of the savings on the immediate payroll side are not matched. The workers, when they're not working, are still earning toward their long-term pension liabilities, and so yet you don't have the payroll associated with them, so you're not necessarily making contributions that help support the benefits that they're actually accruing during that time. And so I would say that's one thing, that you could look carefully at before going down that route again.
And so, and you mentioned you mentioned this state pension liabilities and obligations. Controller, what do you expect the impact to be of this crisis on our state pension obligations and on just the fiscal soundness of PERS and STRS?
Sure. No. So I think out of the global crisis of 2008, both pension funds really prepared better for this time. So I feel very good about the fact that we have sufficient liquidity to pay out the benefits. That's first and foremost. And so our retirees are still getting paid, and we don't foresee any issue with that at all in the near term. But what I will say is, to Gabe's point, in good times when the general fund and the state was able to help the pension funds with supplemental payments, and now taking a little bit of that back to try to help some of our school districts, particularly with our CalSTRS payments. These are the ways that we just try to keep the funds stabilized. Both funds actually did adopt risk mitigation strategies. We also took down our assumed rate of return, which I know did create a lot of pressure on our local government, our public agency employers at the local level. And we reduced the amortization period so that we're not carrying these liabilities for a longer period of time. And so all of those are actually to the good. And so while this is a difficult time with respect to possibly meeting our investment returns, and we'll know more by the end of June with respect to how we've done in this most recent period. It is a time that I think both funds actually are doing better and the way that we intended for it to perform during this kind of a crisis. And I will say that we're not alone in terms of sitting on huge liabilities. We have a retirement crisis, frankly, a pension crisis across this country. But I think both funds have been very diligent about looking at, as I said, adopting risk mitigation strategies, really reducing our costs of running and administering the fund, and also looking at where we can just look at savings and being sure that we are meeting all of our obligations, so that we get into trouble when anybody decides to take a holiday relative to our commitment to the fund.
Right. So we've talked a lot about the pretty daunting challenges that are facing our state right now, and the nation, and indeed the world. Do you see? I like to look for silver linings. Do you see any silver linings kind of in the midst of this crisis, either over the course of the last several months or looking forward? Controller Yee, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I do. Actually, I see a lot of silver linings. I mean, on a very just really personal level, I think it's really just challenged each of us to figure out how we connect with one another in different ways. The idea that we've had to shelter in place and practice social distancing has created a lot of challenges, particularly if we're caring for aging loved ones or people in a high-risk group. I think it is a time where we're seeing just different ways that people are connecting. I think every day we're seeing examples of just ordinary people extending gestures of kindness just to help a neighbor and to really be sure that we're taking care of one another. And I think from that perspective, it's been really a wonderful time of just people rallying together and supporting one another. I think on the bigger picture side, this has really been, and a lot's been said about, what this pandemic has really helped, expose, and that is really the vulnerability of so many of our workers here in California. Prior to the pandemic hitting, I was serving and still am a member of the Governor's Future of Work Commission. And we paused our work because we actually, with the coronavirus, realized the future of work is here. We were thrust into having to work differently and setting up alternative work arrangements. And I think that also will bring some positives. It's been a little bit of an adjustment working remotely for many people. But I think it's also creating some new possibilities with respect to being able to do things virtually, to be able to have more of a broader reach. I've actually been able to participate in conferences with people from around the world on a virtual platform that probably would have been much more difficult to do with trying to get everybody in one place physically at one time. And I think about, I always think about the talent that comes into government as well. This is a time where I think people are recognizing the importance of government, and certainly more people relying on government services. And so I do hope this is also a recognition, particularly among our young people, that this is actually very challenging yet rewarding work that hopefully can attract the next generation of talent.
Mm-hmm. Yes, never has the need to serve our community or been, I think, more urgent or more profound.
Absolutely.
Gabe, any thoughts, silver linings? Anything good?
Well, yeah, I do agree. I think on a very personal level, our office has adapted, and we've, as you can probably see, we've been working remotely a lot, and we've been able to get our work done. And we've been working with the legislature, sometimes testifying in a remote setting. And so that has been a change, but it has gotten me to think about those kinds of technology related firms and that whole industry, which of course is kind of is headquartered, if you will, in California. And was thinking about it earlier today. Actually, I looked up Zoom and compared Zoom, the stock price compared to the stock market. The S&P 500 is up 9.5% since over the past 3 months, but Zoom is up 102%. And that's even after today's big sell-off in the market. And we're talking today here on June 11th. But it just shows you that I think some of these technology-related firms probably will see a pretty significant upside, and there's going to be a lot of demand for those services, and people are looking for new ways to get their work done. And so I do think there will be some growth in that sector as we go forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think another interesting consequence, or a consequence that I hope comes out of this, as we've all been forced to, work from home, work more flexibly, sort of juggle more things. I think it has demonstrated that, given our, the technology-driven world that we live in, that is possible, and that more flexible work schedules are actually possible. We've seen, even, I think, some big name companies have announced that they're closing their corporate headquarters because they've actually realized, it works really well for people to work from home. Or some companies are adopting a hybrid model where they are, letting people choose, do they come into the office or not. So I think that could be a very, an interesting and positive consequence. I think the other thing for me that has really emerged as a big positive has been the rapid progress we've been able to make on telehealth and telemedicine. So, these are things we have been grappling with. I've only been in the legislature for a year and a half. There's been fights about this for like the past decade, and, kind of this hand wringing and, oh, we don't know. And we kind of got forced into it and realized that certainly you can't do everything on telehealth or telemedicine, but then in a lot of respects, you can. And it enables a huge, huge increase in reach and access for our underserved communities and in efficiency of delivery. So I'm excited about that coming out of this as well. So a couple of questions that are coming in over Facebook. So one for you, for the controller: when will the Kafir'our be complete? Will all unspent funds now in a cash balance be free for reallocation unless mandated by status?
So the Kafir'our is in progress. At this point, we are anticipating a late release this year for a whole number of factors, and it'll probably be in the September timeframe. And with respect to the second question, with respect to what's available for expenditure, we are. I know the legislature's plan has more internal borrowing that is actually than what the governor had proposed. And so we will be watching and then revise our cash flows accordingly with respect to where we may have needs for the possibility of external borrowing. But we're actually in a very good borrowable resource position right now.
Okay. And then amongst your many responsibilities, Controller Yee, you're responsible for the state's unclaimed property.
Yes,
so some folks have asked about unclaimed property, which is kind of like the state lost and found. So can you tell folks, how does this work? And is it possible that somebody has some property that they, may be able to claim, and how do they do it?
Very possible. So all of the properties that are being held by the state of California, turned over by businesses who have not been able to locate the rightful owners for that property over the past 3 years, are being held by the state, and it is all listed on a public database. Just visit claimit.ca.gov.
Okay.
claimit.ca.gov. Search under any name that you have used in any kind of legal form, and if you have any unclaimed property, it will be listed on that database. We also have about just under $270 million in life insurance death benefits that belong to loved ones of deceased policyholders. And for those particular benefits, you'll want to do a search under the name of your deceased loved one.
Okay. And a number of our constituents are really excellent sleuths and do a very good job of holding government accountable. So are there any resources that you can point folks to where they can follow the money and keep track of how we're using their tax dollars?
Yeah, a lot of resources actually. So first of all, I'm just thrilled to be sharing this program today with Gabe. Legislative Analyst Office has just does really wonderful work, not only in support of the legislature, but really for the public and for the people of California, with some of its insight pieces and just really following the condition of our finances in California. So that's definitely one resource. Department of Finance issues a monthly bulletin that speaks to revenues and also the state of our economy, economic changes that they're seeing. We provide, the State Controller's Office does a cash report every month that I just spoke about earlier with respect to the cash received for the month of May. So that is also another resource as well. But I would say that, really the oversight role of the legislature, the budget process, and your proceedings being available live stream is also definitely a resource to look at, particularly now, trying to get this budget for the next fiscal year enacted by July 1st.
And anything that you would add, Mr. Petek?
I don't have a lot else to add. I think the monthly reports from the controller's office are a wealth of knowledge and information, and we reference those frequently in our office as we do our work.
Well, thank you again both for joining us. Before we wrap up, I'd just like to turn it back to each of you, just briefly, to make any closing remarks or closing thoughts that you'd leave our folks at home with.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you again, Assemblywoman, for having Gabe and myself on the program today. This is a time where I hope that the people of California, and certainly your constituents, know that government is open for business. We've not missed a beat in terms of the critical functions that we need to continue to carry on. And I just want to just say kudos to my team. We haven't missed anything. We continue to make payments. We're issuing tax refunds. Everything is going out as scheduled, payroll, all that. And so, all of that is really important because Californians are counting on so much of that today, much more than possibly that they have in the past. The question that came in about the Kafir'our, our financial reporting function continues to be critical. We've had some challenges with technology, but I think we are doing our best to get that out on time for just to understand what has happened with this year that just closed, and so that's another source of information as well. This is a time we talked about earlier when we started this program about the heightened scrutiny and oversight that needs to happen during this time, because obviously a lot of transactions are happening quickly. We're in an emergency situation, and so I would say that the function of audits is really probably going to gain more prominence as we go on in time. We do have on our website a tracking of all of the COVID-19 expenditures, and so and really citing the executive order authority that has allowed those expenditures to take place. But we just felt it was important to just continue to provide as much of that information to the public as possible. So I just want to say thank you. Obviously, having these types of programs to keep your constituents and the public informed, this is what government is about, and I appreciate your commitment to transparency and accountability.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate all that you do and your commitment to California. And Mr. Petek, parting thoughts.
No, I also would just like to say thank you for including me and our office to participate in today's town hall. I actually would echo a lot of what the controller said. We think that the oversight function is very critical, and in fact, we've been working with you, Assembly member, and your colleagues to make sure that the legislature has proper oversight of the spending that the administration has been doing and is proposing to do, especially in this period where it is challenging. The legislature was on recess for part of the spring when you would normally be there, and so there's an understandable need for some flexibility on the part of the administration to act in a nimble fashion. But at the same time, it's critical for us to now that we're back and in Sacramento, it's important for us to make sure that the legislature has its proper oversight and authority as it makes decisions. That it's really the co-equal branch of government with the appropriation power under the Constitution, and so that's something that we've been working with you on, and we do agree with the controller. It's very important. So thank you again, though, for having me.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thank you both for making that point. I could not agree more that that the oversight role that we play in ensuring accountability for taxpayers' dollars is absolutely critical. I think the last thing that I wanted to share is, as we were talking about recovery, really and truly, is that the legislative analyst said, so much of this is unknown. And so much of this has to do with our ability to manage this disease, and whether or not we're able to set California up on a path for rapid recovery comes down to whether we are able to continue to reopen the economy safely and responsibly. And the truth is that doesn't come down to the three of us, that doesn't come down to my legislative colleagues, that doesn't come down to the governor, that comes down to each and every one of us taking steps and using common sense precautions to ensure that we are able to control the spread of COVID-19, that we're able to get this pandemic under control, and that we're able to safely reopen California's economy and move on this path to recovery. So for everyone at home, thank you for all that you are doing. Stay safe and be strong. Thank you.